Hello everyone, this is Vikram Prakash and you are listening to Architecture Talk, the podcast designed to advance the frontier of architectural thinking. Today I am talking to my friend Manu Sobti, Senior Lecturer at the University of Brisbane in Australia. Manu has been working on the archives of Pierre Jeanneret and those of Aditya Prakash at the Canadian Centre for Architecture. And he stopped by in Seattle on his way to Atlanta. And I asked him what he found in those archives and how he likes to think about the role and contribution of these two people in the making of modern India and modern Indian architecture. I hope you enjoy this conversation. Here we go.
Architecture is really the art and science of turning fiction into fact.
Sometimes kind of real architectural life interferes with intellectual architectural life.
There is no such thing as architecture.
Okay, so welcome to Architecture Talk, Manu. Welcome back, I think. We've had one conversation earlier when we were working more together on GAHTC and your Uzbekistan and corridors of
peripheries of contact
a module for GAHTC and complex global history questions. This time I don't want to do that. In fact, let's have a very focused question and a conversation on your interest in my hometown, which is Chandigarh, and the research that you have done in relationship to that on my father's work and Pierre Jeanneret. And you're working towards a book called Pierre Jeanneret, right? So let me start at the other end. You're a hardcore Ahmedabadi, CEPT graduate. I remember you as a furiously hardworking, worky structuralist student from CEPT days from the early 90s. And from there you went to MIT, and then you went to Georgia Tech where you did your PhD. Then you were teaching in Milwaukee, and now you're teaching in Brisbane, Queensland, University of Queensland. So after all that trajectory, how did you end up in Chandigarh? Why the interest in Chandigarh?
Well, good afternoon, Vikram. It's been a long time since we've talked like this. We last talked in 2017, if I remember right.
Yeah.
And so much has happened since that time. In fact, some of the stuff that I will talk about today had already started to happen at that point. And the idea that I put forward at that point was peripheries of contact.
Oh.
So I have always been interested in how people come to places, how they interact with other people who are there. And this interaction with Chandigarh happened in the course of my student trips to India. I used to take quite a few trips from the United States.
From Milwaukee.
From Milwaukee. We used to call them winterims.
Winterims.
Because they were like compressed semester courses.
How
that
many
I used
weeks?
Between 3 and 5 weeks.
3 and 5 weeks.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I used to do a lot of them. And I used to do the winterim in India, and I used to do a summerim in Uzbekistan. But anyway, that's a different story.
Oh.
But these winterims were popular because this was a very good time to travel to India.
Oh.
So we crafted the trip in a way where we would spend time in Delhi, in Ahmedabad, in Jaipur, and then we would usually culminate in either Chandigarh or in Ahmedabad. So I did craft these connections with people in Ahmedabad, hoping to run some sort of a compressed studio that I could start in Ahmedabad or elsewhere and then take back to Milwaukee and make a full-blown studio out of it.
So sort of fieldwork startup in Chandigarh.
Exactly.
Or Ahmedabad, and complete it in Milwaukee.
Exactly.
So why Chandigarh? You are going to the great glories of Ahmedabad and Jaipur and Delhi and all that.
Yeah, because I feel that when we were in Ahmedabad, there was always this pressure to extract more from the older city, from the traditional city, from the pole.
Study the pole.
Study the pole.
This is what everybody does in Ahmedabad.
And
pole meaning the sort of the old city cul-de-sacs.
Yes, the old city cul-de-sacs, the ones that were built in this organic, accretive way.
Yes.
And one of the things that was always told was that you cannot study buildings in isolation in the pole. You have to study them alongside each other as an urban fabric, which I agree with. And then we were told that, well, if the pole is accretive, then the other buildings in the newer part of Ahmedabad are standalone objects, as it were, island
convenient
buildings.
Binary.
Yeah, very convenient binary.
Yeah.
So then when we came to Chandigarh, there was, of course, I had my own personal favorites, and my personal favorites were the...
No, but why did you come to Chandigarh? You could have gone Fatehpur Sikri, you could have gone Shimla.
It was a new city. I was quite taken up with the fabric of the city and how the fabric of the city was woven together. It was the first time I thought that kind of fabric had persisted and survived. It had also prospered over time. I also had very good childhood memories of Chandigarh.
Oh, now we are cutting to the chase.
Yeah, I visited Chandigarh when I was barely in my teens.
Visited from Delhi?
From Delhi. We went to Patiala for some time, and then we went to Chandigarh. We could only spend a few days in Chandigarh. We stayed with my uncle in Sector 16. And at that time, because of less pollution... Handas, exactly. At that time, because of less pollution, you could actually see the mountains from Chandigarh.
Right.
Which I got to see again during COVID when there was no traffic. But in the middle, while I was taking students, I always told them there is a myth that you can see the mountains, and they would not believe me because they could not see any.
Right.
So we could see the mountains from my uncle's house. And then we, of course, went for walks to the Capitol complex. I was, as a teenager, early teenager, I was always taken up with the fact that liminality between the Monumental Plaza and the building was an extraordinarily large space. And it gave free access to the pigeons to go inside the body of the buildings. My child's mind, or grown-up child's mind, at that time thought the buildings were problematic, to say the least.
Problematic?
Problematic in terms of scale, that they were too large for smaller human beings that stood alongside them.
I see.
Anyway, fast forwarding.
No. So that means you're Punjabi, basically. No?
I also saw chaiwalas and other people sitting in the shade of those very large umbrella-like liminal spaces.
How did you survive as a Punjabi in the very more cultured places like Ahmedabad and Calcutta?
Well, let me start with Calcutta. Calcutta actually...
No, give me a bottom line answer, man. How did you survive as a Punjabi?
I survived well. I was very popular in Ahmedabad because they translated me not into a Punjabi. They actually called me Manu Bhai.
Oh, they thought you were Guju Bhai.
Yeah, so then they actually... And I tried to learn Gujarati. My grammar was very bad because I would only pick up a few words, and then I would add everything to every sentence. I would add some che or saras.
Okay. You camouflaged your way through like
Yeah, and of course I was friendly enough, so I actually talked with a lot of people.
What are you talking? You were fighting with everybody. I remember that you were fighting with Gurjeet. You were fighting with everybody except you were not friendly. You were a studious overachiever type.
So, but it was a very good time, and it was one of the best times. I cherished that time and the memory of.
So this is what I like about you. It's like you are one of the few people who wanted to go back to Chandigarh because he has some childhood memory of Chandigarh.
Yeah, absolutely. I was intrigued by how I would find it next time I went there.
So you didn't find any poles in Chandigarh?
No, I didn't find any poles. I was not even expecting to find any poles. I was expecting to find good places to eat, and I found them.
So what did you find in Chandigarh?
I found very large spaces, almost desolate spaces.
You're talking about the capital or the city?
Well, even within the city, even when I come to a place like Sector 17, I found...
So you're critiquing the city?
Well, I'm starting by critiquing the city. I found a certain amount of desolation. And, there is a desolation in the winter months when people tend to come out in the open, but that desolation is also there, particularly in the summer months when heat actually radiates from the concrete paving that is out there.
So do you think Chandigarh is urbanistically successful or not?
I think the urbanistic success of Chandigarh is largely in the mind of intellectuals. But how Chandigarh succeeds is, I think, part of...
You're talking intellectual like you and me. Are you talking about me?
I'm talking about this crowd of people who might be listening to me, or the crowd of people who actually publishes books on Chandigarh.
That's
but
me.
but I don't think we are talking so much. I want
So
to
you're
talk.
not talking about the Sardar apna Punjabi bhai in Chandigarh.
I actually want to talk about them because they are the ones who really experience the city the way it should be experienced.
Yes.
And I
And
feel
do they like the city or not?
for them it's like a stage set against which they are enacting a particular, as I say, choreography, and it happens all the time. And they have
Acha, stage set.
yeah, and they have put
Your theatre has not left you.
well, no, but I consider it's a stage set that is
So tell us a little bit. So you grew up in theatre, no?
yes.
You did theatre with Barry John, Abraham El Qazi for 10 years. How long did you do?
About 10 years, yes.
All through school.
All through school. From my 4th standard till my 12th standard.
St. Xavier's
St. Xavier's, yeah.
in Delhi.
In Delhi.
So now you see everything as theatre and stage set.
Well, after all, good theatre is like life. You don't even see that there's an act going on.
You think life is like good theatre.
It is, yes, because we do
That
a lot
is
of
more interesting, no?
we do a lot of enactments which are theatrical. Like sometimes we talk to people theatrically. When we talk to people who we don't know theatrically.
We are performing theatre right now.
I don't think we are.
We are?
Yeah.
This is theatre. Of course this is theatre. Teaching is theatre, recording
Teaching to
podcasts is
some
theatre.
degree is theatre. To play one versus the other, to contest a point, yes, it could be theatre.
So you were saying that the Chandigarh Punjabis, the Sardars and all my friends are performing theatre in Chandigarh. What do you mean?
What I mean is that they, from the day they are born till the time they become teenagers and they develop an opinion about the city, I think they actually start familiarizing themselves with the city as a stage set behind them, and they become comfortable with it, and or their behavior and the way in which they occupy spaces in the city almost becomes part of this. I would say.
Give me a specific example. How is that different from anybody growing up in any city?
Because I feel that Chandigarh has so much of, let's say, there's a disciplinary rigor in it, and there's a prescriptiveness in Chandigarh that is not there in other cities. Chandigarh wants you to
For
look.
example?
For example, if you go to Sector 17, you are intended to actually see Sector 17 and the marketplace in a particular way in order for you to enjoy that marketplace.
Like how?
You are not meant to see the arbitrary way in which the peripheral buildings have been cut and spaces made behind them. You're meant to read that space of Sector 17 in a piazza-like manner, which it actually is not. And you're meant to read it as...
It's not a piazza. The Neelam Piazza is a piazza?
Well, it's called a piazza. It doesn't mean it is a piazza.
It's a pizza.
If it was a real piazza, then I think it would be enclosed in a manner quite different.
You are too postmodernist, man. Everything doesn't have to be Piazza San Marco to be a piazza.
But the reason why I bring this up is because I think Corb is, for example, playing a game in the Sector 17 versus the Capitol Complex.
Yeah.
In the Capitol Complex, the buildings are figurative in the ground of the plaza.
Yeah.
But in Sector 17, the piazza is figurative in the ground of buildings that surround it. But the buildings are not solidly made like a poche around the piazza or plaza. They are made into these objects that somewhat softly control the activity inside the piazza.
Yes, without slapping you around and saying it's a piazza.
Yeah.
It's a soft piazza.
Yeah, but so
is a soft piazza better than a hard piazza or worse?
I think for the sake of Chandigarh, for the sake of an Indian city, it is the right approach. But at the same time, Corbusier also contradicts that by actually forcing you to situate yourself at a particular point and look at the piazza. If you, for example, went to one of those parking lots or one of those interruptions in the surrounding fabric, you would not read that piazza as a piazza. You would see it as a very disorganized system of buildings. So, for example, when you went to the place, if you went outside Sector 17 on the edges where Mehfil restaurant was situated, and which has recently collapsed. I heard a few months ago the whole building collapsed.
Achha.
Yeah, and there's no restaurant inside it, and the whole building has collapsed like a pack of cards, and now the Chandigarh administration is sort of perplexed as to what they will do next about that. If you go to that lane, you realize that Sector 17 doesn't really have any, how should I say, substance, or I want to use a Hindi word, astitva. You know, the astitva or the character of the plaza to hold it in place.
No. What is the difference between the relationship with the alleys in Venice that surround Piazza San Marco? You know, you're in these narrow alleys which go left, right, center.
Yeah.
And then suddenly they push you out.
I think the most important difference between Venice and Chandigarh is scalar contrast. There's a very strong notion of scalar contrast in Venice, but not there in Chandigarh.
No doubt.
And because of the fact that there's so little fabric to create that scalar contrast, therefore Chandigarh doesn't succeed like Venice.
Completely agreed, but it's the sort of chaos and density of the Mehfil kind of area and the impossibility of going through it and no finding parking and streets going through it that then set you up for the piazza in the same way.
If there was more shopping, if there were more shopkeepers, if there was much more of a chance of a hut, for example, happening in the piazza, in the Neelam Piazza, it would have been a similar kind of situation.
Okay.
But right now, it is neither a piazza, nor a marketplace, nor a bazaar, nor a carnival ground. It is as something is sort of disjointed.
Okay, so that's good. I like it. So what I've learned from you is Sector 17 is singular and unique. It doesn't fit any identity template that you have been trained in CEPT, MIT and Georgia Tech.
Yeah, it is, and maybe it's incomplete deliberately. And I'm bowing to Corb here. Maybe he thought better. Maybe it's incomplete, and which is why I always think that PTT building that would have actually come in the middle of that piazza, which was not built, which is there in the sketches, may have actually done something more to that piazza than that empty space right now. So the PTT building would have occupied that point in the piazza, the large clearing, and it would have actually given it a direction, an emphasis.
Okay, so that's what that is. Now, but you were running these short programs, and the studios were all on the city fabric, on Sector 17, etc., or what did you do?
Well, we started by introducing the students to the city per se. Very quickly, it was almost like a immersion. We used to generally do it over 3 or 4 days, and then we would pick up a particular point or points in the city. We've got increasingly interested in the villages around Chandigarh.
Why?
So, because we felt that the village fabric was of great contrast against the fabric of Chandigarh. For example, to the northern and the northwestern edge of the capital, Kansal, the village fabric is actually in a totally different direction, and the only distinction between the capital area and the village is a brick culvert and a road. And that is a very, very disjointed way to stop a fabric from the other side. I do agree that fabric on the other side may have actually had its roots in the agrarian subdivisions that happened, but it is nevertheless quite interesting for me that none of that really percolated through the plaza. I would have thought that if that effort was being made in order to connect the village to the city, which is purported what Corbusier was doing, because he wanted to merge the gridiron with the village, then more of an effort needed to be made. I also saw that in the earlier pictures that I found at CCA, that plaza...
CCA, you mean Canadian Centre for Architecture?
The Canadian Centre for
Chandigarh College of Architecture?
Well, a Canadian Centre for Architecture.
Because the original is Chandigarh College of Architecture.
Absolutely.
CCA came, Canadian Centre for Architecture came later, okay?
Yeah. So at the Canadian Centre for Architecture, I found this archive which shows that these buildings, when they were constructed, the Monumental Assembly Building, Secretariat Building, High Court Building, and all the other buildings, there was all the leftover spaces. They were full of caverns. They were pockmarked with talabs and depressions where water collected. And it's only later that these giant bulldozers and earth movers would have flattened it and hurriedly put the flatness of the plaza on top of it, which I felt took away from the palimpsest of that particular site. And maybe it was just like a whitewashing. It was the semblance of completing the project, as it were. Maybe very little attention was really paid to how that plaza would be constructed.
So you don't like the plaza?
Oh, of course not. The plaza is the problem. I think the buildings are like what Doshi would have said, frozen dreams, and they have their fallacies, they have their problems, they have their logistical issues, but they are buildings with where you can think about them in different ways. But I think the plaza is the one that stops you in your tracks, literally and figuratively.
So you haven't read my new book, clearly, which makes the big case for the plazas.
Okay, well, I haven't always not read some things. Oh, it does. How does it make it?
Well, I argue that as the spaces of democracy, it requires a performative engagement to produce an idea of an active citizenship rather than a passive citizenship. So, for instance, Kingsway in Delhi, you don't have to be a citizen. You are told what you are as a citizen.
By the space, you mean?
Yes, because of the axis. It sets up, there's the grand axis, and you are lined up with it. And now that has been reinforced by the Central Vista project.
I do agree with that. However, I also tend to think that landscape spaces, in terms of their original and archival character, can also give rise to gathering possibilities. And this Foucauldian idea...
is a different thing. Gathering is a different thing. That's Neelam Plaza.
No, but I'm saying that this Foucauldian idea that the flatness of the plaza is required in order to be an instrument to demonstrative democracy.
Yeah,
I think is
demonstrative protest democracy is something else.
Okay.
Protest democracy requires a sense of a plaza.
Okay.
Where you can identify yourself as a collective, and then you can protest against something. And I argue that space is Sector 17. All right? This is a different idea of citizenship.
Participatory.
No, it's a very individualized production of citizenship. It has its lineages, the stroll gardens, space where citizens have to walk and converse and produce themselves into citizens.
Okay.
Of an era of modernity. It doesn't assume that just because you're alive and have a vote, you're automatically a citizen. A citizen has to produce themselves through movement through space and through conversation and dialogue and debate and discussion, which is a long, arduous and difficult and always somewhat incomplete project because it takes time, and Corbusier saw himself as still an in-production modern citizen.
Okay.
So very different idea of citizen.
Okay. Though he could have also taken that idea from the constructivists. Because when the constructivists were thinking about spaces in Moscow, they were thinking about this kind of democracy, this kind of responsibility of people to make conversations.
Citizenship as responsibility.
Yes.
Citizenship as a gathering place where you protest, as citizenship as demanding rights.
Okay.
So the difference between citizenship and rights and citizenship and responsibilities.
Okay.
But okay, let's spend a little bit of time on the frozen dreams. So you buy that, the reading of the Capitol buildings?
I would say yes and no. Because I think if you really, if you think about the elements of the building that in some ways challenge the visuality that you expect from a building, I think then those edges are like essentially collaged to the core of the building. In my class, in my studio, I always call the Secretariat building as the Nutella bar building. I call the assembly as the donut building, the square donut building. And I call the High Court building as the on-edge club sandwich building. So in some ways, I always explain it that they are dressed.
I can see High Court as a club sandwich for sure.
So they are always dressed in these garbs that are unexpected sometimes, and they are surreal, and they are different from each side. But the inside core, I feel, is fairly conventional. It is a very logistically necessary post and beam construction into which spaces have been embedded. I think Corbusier does have his bag of tricks in the way in which he arranges the spaces, which is his merit and his his talent.
Yeah.
But I think the outside, the way it's merged with the inside, is incongruous. So when you, for example, look at the section through the large gargoyle in the assembly building, and how that section kind of stops rather abruptly to where the building inside starts. I think that is a problematic moment, but we kind of give him that space and say he's Corbusier, so he can do what he really wants. Or when, for example, the hyperbolic paraboloid drum on the inside, when it sits into that square geometry and there are these odd corners that are left, we give him the space that he really wants. Or when,
so you're saying just because the big man, we should let him get away with it?
We should let him give him a little space.
Not very flattering.
And considering something that I know that a lot of people don't, that Corbusier was only on the site for limited amounts of time. Sometimes he was on site even when the building was not built, or he came on site when the building had already been built. So I think...
so you're making excuses for him now?
No, I'm saying that it was a transmission of thought. So he, for example, sent his drawings to Chandigarh, and then Pierre Jeanneret and his team of architects actually, in some ways, controlled the future of the drawing.
They diluted the projects instead of enriching them.
Well, I don't think they diluted the monumental buildings per se. They may have diluted their impact in terms of their scale, size, finish, which they did, from what I know. Corbusier thought that Pierre Jeanneret and Drew and Fry, they actually did dilute the nature of the sectors, because he actually has a letter at CCA that says that he finds what happened inside the sector a little bit disappointing in terms of what he wanted and what became of it.
Right. So let's talk now a little bit about the relationship between Pierre Jeanneret and Le Corbusier. I mean, you've worked quite a lot on Pierre Jeanneret, right?
Yeah.
What have you learned?
Okay, so I've spent about 2 seasons of research at the CCA in 2022.
You mean that Canadian place?
Yeah, the Canadian place, not CCA.
Not the real CCA.
I have spent a lot of time in CCA as well, the other CCA, and thoroughly enjoyed myself. But at the other CCA in Montreal, the very cold one, there are many things I've learned. First, and I'll just try to enumerate them. Number one is that there was a perception of a cordial and warm relationship between Pierre Jeanneret and Le Corbusier.
What do you mean perception?
Literature, scholarship would have us believe that they were happy cousins when they worked together.
No, they fought over the war. They didn't speak to each other from basically 1942 to 1950.
We do, but we do not reflect on how that affected the work that they produced. And I feel that in Chandigarh, when I look at the projects and I look at the monumental projects that Corbusier did versus the projects that Pierre Jeanneret did, of course they were slightly differently trained. And to be very honest, Pierre Jeanneret was working for Corbusier's project, as it were, but their languages were quite different one from the other. The monumental language that Corbusier had, the demonstrative language that Corbusier had, was nowhere similar to the functional aesthetic of Jeanneret. And when I say functional, I may be underselling him, because it was in many ways an elegant functionalism. It was not frugal. It was controlled. It was measured, and it was in some ways, for the conditions that were there, it was just correct.
Jeanneret was the perfect person to execute the buildings and detail them and run the office, and Corbusier came in with the big ideas and the sort of beautiful gestures.
Well, I don't think Corbusier would have been able to get Chandigarh built by himself if Jeanneret had not been around.
No ways he would have had. Yeah.
And this makes me move to my second observation, which is that in contrast to Corbusier's very verbose and somewhat, I think, overbearing, and some people would call it arrogant, and
unquestionably arrogant.
And some people who I know well would call it charismatic attitude. Jeanneret was extremely quiet. He was and almost clinically quiet in the way in which he did not really express his views about things. He spoke very little. Even in India, after 15 years, he spoke very little Hindi or Hindustani, only very few words. He spoke very little English. He appears to have done this dumb charades very often that his Indian colleagues very willingly and lovingly translated to the ideas he really had. So it's quite amazing that Corbusier gets perceived more and more as a taskmaster and as arrogant, while Jeanneret, even though he doesn't speak, gets perceived as someone who can actually run an office and who, in my parlance, becomes the bureaucrat architect.
But let's focus in on this a little bit. It's quite true. Pierre ran the Chandigarh Capital Project office basically for 15 years without speaking English. That office ran, man. They built a huge amount. I'm not talking just about the Capitol buildings.
Yeah.
And they trained a whole cadre of architects and draftsmen and raised them and moved them up and very successful. It was with a shock that very recently I realized that Pierre Jeanneret didn't even speak really English. How did that happen? He was dumb charading with everybody? What's your sense?
I think he was able to establish a very good working relationship with people.
How?
Just by, first maybe by drawing, then by example, then by the buildings he did, and then by actually letting them do what they were doing. Some people say...
How did he get the work done without speaking English?
In the archives, I never came across anyone ever saying that he was argumentative.
No, I got that. That's not what I'm asking. I'm asking, how did he get the work done?
I think just by seeing how work was done within the Indian context for a long time, how once you stuck to austerity and to just what was important to be done, the kernel of the building, the core of the building, everything would work forwards from there.
So this is the astonishing thing about Pierre Jeanneret.
Absolutely.
He's this meek cousin of Corbusier's from Geneva or somewhere.
Absolutely.
Who spent a certain amount of his life in Paris.
Yeah.
And then hangs out somewhere in south of France, etc. during the war, and afterwards try to make a practice in Paris. And then shows up in Punjab.
Yep.
In India.
Yep.
And essentially lives the last 15 years of his life there.
Absolutely.
And runs a huge successful building office without even speaking English. Forget about Hindi and Punjabi.
Absolutely. And he was not very large. He was not very tall.
He was 5 feet or something.
Absolutely. So in fact, I'll read out something from my writing.
Yeah.
Jeet Malhotra was one of the people on the Capital Project Committee.
Yeah.
So on this front, in Jeet Malhotra's musings as one among the junior members on the Capital Project team in his myriad of roles between 1951 and 68, Malhotra notes that little was known about Jeanneret's, or JT as he was called.
PJ.
JT.
JT?
JT, yeah. Or JT's very modest and unassuming character. Building on JT's own words, Malhotra paints him as a small man standing, quote, 3 millimeters taller than Napoleon, end quote, who wears a bow tie, leads an elusive life, but is extremely charming, alert, and hospitable upon meeting. Despite the rigors of the Indian heat and his characteristically bad digestion, which is Jeanneret's digestion, perhaps exaggerated by the reputedly colourless cooking of his domestic servant Bansi, Jeanneret had made Chandigarh his modest home. So there is something that's going on with Jeanneret. I mean, I've always have felt that he's working very hard to make Chandigarh his home. He doesn't go back to France, to Europe too many times.
He's not trying. He makes it his own.
He makes it his home, yes. Yeah.
He builds hundreds of buildings.
Yes. 150 some buildings.
He has his ashes immersed into Sukna Lake in Chandigarh.
Yes.
Not in Geneva.
Yes, absolutely. And he's like, he's living like a recluse in some ways. In fact, people are sort of a bit stunned why he's living like that.
My father calls him a saint.
Yeah. So I also...
Not a saint in the Christian sense. He's thinking of him as a saint, as a sant.
Yeah. Like a celibate, you know, like someone who's like just given himself for the sake of the project. Because in this office, apparently, at the birthdays that Jeanneret had, they would give him these birthday cards. I found at least 3 cards that said that he's the most eligible bachelor in the office.
Yes. So what does that mean? Well, there's some Maybe he was a womanizer also.
Well, maybe, but I did not find any such thing on him, but I did find stuff on Corbusier.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah,
Let's
so,
not leave
yeah.
that. No, I want to stick to the basic fact.
Yeah.
How did he manage to be successful? Nothing commends him to be successful. He is the underling of Corbusier. He's a diminutive man. He's shy. He doesn't speak much. He doesn't speak the language.
I think for Corbusier, this was an architectural project.
Forget about Corbusier. I'm talking about
No. For Corbusier, Chandigarh was an architectural project, and in fact, that's what I also say, that when the Punjab album is being made and Corbusier is sketching, and that Punjab album is now shared and the public know about it, while Corbusier is leveraging the observations in the Punjab album for making a project, Jeanneret, on the other hand, is literally slow cooking that site, and he's actually, all his observations are about what he wants to become and how he wants to transform himself. So his photography, his sketches, his writings are all about the way he's changing over time. I was personally struck by this when I saw the Marg issue that came out in the late 50s on Chandigarh.
Early 60s.
Yeah. So where all the real estate in that magazine was occupied primarily by Le Corbusier and then a few other people, and Jeanneret only got the last 2 pages. And in the last 2 pages, he doesn't even talk about architecture.
He talks about art.
He talks about river stones.
River stones.
About the found condition
Yes.
of site.
Yes.
And that struck me, and I said, what is the man really up to? It's almost like, and it was true, later I found that he was disappointed with what his cousin was doing.
I want to find out how Pierre functioned. So go further on this. Why did he represent himself as just this river rock person? I mean, he invented the Great River Rock Wall.
Yes.
Randall Rubber Masonry walls.
Yeah.
So those are all over Chandigarh.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So he invented that. That's beautiful construction.
Yeah.
Sort of the rock garden can be seen as a Pierre Jeanneret inheritance.
Yeah, absolutely. And almost empowered by Pierre Jeanneret.
Empowered, it comes out of Pierre Jeanneret.
Yeah.
So generally people present rock garden as the antithesis of Chandigarh.
Yeah.
Actually, it's kind of a derivative from Pierre Jeanneret's viewpoint on Chandigarh.
Yeah.
Correct?
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree.
And in my father's work, there's a postcard which my Jeanneret sent my father, where he takes a piece of steel which has been cut to make shuttering to pour concrete, and all the leftover steel Jeanneret holds up and says, "Wow, this is art."
Okay.
Yeah. And there's a correspondence between my father and Pierre, or JT. They called him JT?
Yeah, in some of the letters he's called JT actually.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
I've always called him PJ.
Okay, PJ like
Pierre Jeanneret.
Meaning?
Pajamas.
No, but is that your own?
No. A lot of people call him PJ.
Okay. No.
But I wonder why JT. Of course, J to T.
Yeah.
Jeanneret.
Ah.
Everybody in India only called him Jeanneret. Nobody called him Pierre, of course,
Yeah,
because
yeah.
nobody would dare to.
Yeah, it would not be respectable.
Yeah.
Sahib.
Yeah. But they all love him. Shivdat Sharma, till this date, he doesn't stop singing the praises of him. My dad loved him. Why?
I think he was a simple man. He was very involved in what was happening. His photography, from what I see, I mean, there are lots of photographs in the CCA archives that Pierre Jeanneret took, and his proteges took, the people who worked with him and the people he mentored in the capital project team, and they are pictures not of architectural delights or things that could be developed into architectural ideas. They are pictures of life as it goes on. They are pictures of space and time that existed in Chandigarh prior to the making of the city, and he's deeply interested in that. And later on, in the 50s, Jeanneret, in his photography, he gets interested in the patina of change that is happening in the city, because for him the city is not a formal object that will survive time. He doesn't write about this is my reading, that he is trying to show that the city is a work in progress. It will go from one point to the other, and the buildings will perish with time, but what will remain will be the tradition of building. So I think what he's trying to put forward is Chandigarhi vernacular, which is made of simple materials combined together in particular ways, with a rigor, with a discipline, and he's hoping that that will continue and become the vernacular of the region. Which
What did you just call it? Chandigarhi
Chandigarh
vernacular.
vernacular.
Oh my God, that's a great term.
So
I call it a Chandigarh style.
yeah,
But maybe it is better understood as a Chandigarhi modernist vernacular.
yeah.
Is it reasonable to call it a vernacular?
I think it is reasonable to call it because it's dressage. You know, the way the facades are made with simple materials, combining stone with brick,
no,
sometimes
all the
flat
Ahmedabad
surfaces.
people are going to kill you to call Chandigarh a vernacular.
That's what but vernaculars can happen anywhere. They only depend on a place having a lived tradition, and that's what Jeanneret was able to do. He was able to.
But he's inventing a tradition.
He's inventing a tradition in terms of the formal elements of the tradition, but he's using the tradition the way he found them in the photographs, in the dwellings, in the settlements that were there, the villages that were surviving at the time when the bulldozing probably happened in Chandigarh, or the records of which we don't really have. And I'm trying to get those records from the army archives.
Do you think the genre vernacular is derived from the villages? I mean, river rock, nobody built with river rock in the villages.
Well, they did. They built,
built out of mud.
but they did combine the mud with other materials.
With
It
the
was not-
husk from the fields and
they had flat roofs.
gobar.
But the edges of their walls did slope down.
Yeah, they did, but nobody built with river rock the way. That's a genre invention, no?
Yeah,
Because that requires concrete. Yeah, I mean, it requires cement.
yeah, but at least the play of light on the walls is similar in some ways, because the surface is not flat like a modernist building would have. It has more texture on it, which is the closest thing you could have with an adobe building, with where the supposed imperfections in some ways catch light very differently than a plastered surface would get. And I'm arguing, because you asked me that question, but I feel that is the closest thing he could have done. He probably would not have gotten away with making sloping walls, adobe walls. So I think he was trying to remain within the allowance that the engineers and what Nehru's modernity was trying to iron down, and at the same time he was trying to do what he thought was right for that particular place. I think he was trying to merge the two together in his mind as he was changing as a person.
That's true. I mean, I think that's right. That he wouldn't be allowed to build with mud.
Yeah.
And I think my father may have been wrong about this, that because he talks about one event where they built a mud wall in the back of the Capital Project Planning Office in Sector 19. And that wall fell over after a while, and then they decided, no, this is not a good experiment.
Yeah.
But
Jeanneret also never paved any surfaces. When he came to Chandigarh to do his photography, Jean Moore was this photographer he was a Swiss photographer.
Jean who?
Jean Moore, M-O-H-R. And he was a Swiss photographer who photographed refugees, migrants, and people have called him a humanist. And his photographs were today are quite well known. Edward Said, for example, says that his photography, Jean Moore's photography, was such that it was almost as if we look at ourselves. And he was referring here to the Palestine, to the Middle Eastern scenario. So Jean Moore, where he comes to Chandigarh, he comes in the mid-1960s, a little bit earlier than the time that Jeanneret is leaving. And following conversations with him, he photographs the city much like the patina that is gathering on the city. And the city is no longer that perfect object.
Where are these photographs published?
They are at CCA.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And he shows how the spaces have now been taken over, and this indigenous modernism has actually been added on as a layer to the buildings that are already there. So the bus adda, the bus stand, for instance, and then the shopping complexes, they all have these people who are sitting at the entrances on the inside. Spectacular photographs. I'll show them in my presentation later this evening.
So this is heretic, Manu. You're claiming Jeanneret, JT, invented a localist vernacular in Chandigarh.
Yeah.
So you're saying he made a Chandigarh version of the Ahmedabad pole?
I would not. I don't think he was. He was
not
in
a pole.
Yeah, he was not even. I don't think he was comparing to anything.
No, I am comparing.
Yeah.
But just calling it a vernacular
Yeah,
makes
yeah,
it
yeah.
equivalent to the pole
Yeah, absolutely.
or the Haveli.
Yeah, and he has 14 typologies.
Maybe your terminology is all wrong because you're an Ahmedabad trained. So unless it's a vernacular, it's nothing.
By vernacular, I meant that it has rigor that will allow it to survive, that will actually allow it to be moved forward in time, and people who build other buildings, they will actually deploy components of that vernacular because they have become...
No, that's not that's just a style. People copied Corbusier all over the place also. Shivnath Prasad, Doshi, Korea, everybody copied Corbusier, right? That doesn't make it a vernacular.
Yeah.
What you described earlier is much more powerful, that he sort of was able to work with the sense of locality and local materials and even local ways of construction. Because this is in part my argument about the chairs. The chairs he designed in Chandigarh are also a vernacular. The Chandigarh chairs are a vernacular, I would argue. Of course, they don't want to admit to that because they say, no, it's Charlotte Perry and Jean Prouvé and this is very Swiss French and so on and so forth. Oh, sure, but then Jeanneret's architecture in Chandigarh is also actually Swiss French.
Charlotte Perriand, yes, could be thought of. She was very close to Jeanneret.
Yeah.
And
I want to stay with the vernacular question. On the furniture.
So then the tubular furniture in Chandigarh could be something.
What tubular furniture in Chandigarh?
The steel furniture in Chandigarh with the thick cushions, where the leather was replaced by Rexine and the foam was replaced by coir on the inside. The deep green and the deep reds, which are there, they're also drawn in the sketches of Le Corbusier, and they also are seen in some of the photographs of the Capitol Complex buildings. That's a tubular steel furniture. That furniture has taken from Charlotte Perriand's furniture.
Okay, forget about that.
But the teak wood furniture is absolutely Jeanneret. I totally
agree. It is Jeanneret, but is it a vernacular?
It is a vernacular in the joinery of it, in the way in which teak wood is used in a particular way, and its tolerances and its size.
That's all.
I think, more than that, I would say the scale of it maybe, because they are. I've seen the chairs at your place. Yeah. They're not grandiose chairs. They are chairs that are meant to sit a particular size of individual.
I want to stay with the vernacular.
Okay.
You have a powerful concept here.
Okay.
A radical claim.
Okay. And you want to trap me.
No, I don't want to trap you. I want you to think rigorously and fully behind it, because I think it's a powerful claim.
Okay.
And I want to extend it to other things and see whether it applies to the furniture also, because that's not how it is being sold in all the auction houses as a Chandigarh vernacular.
How is it sold?
It's sold as genre, European heritage discarded by the Indian post-colonials who did not value it.
Yeah. My trouble with the furniture, my only trouble with the furniture is that it seemed to have appeared only within the buildings, within the monumental buildings of Chandigarh.
No, it's all over the university.
All over the university. What I'm saying is it's not gone into the homes of people.
It is in the homes.
Only a few of the people who recognize what the furniture, but it was not like, for example, it hasn't gone to the homes of the peons.
It did, particularly after it was sold for cheap. It used to go into poor people's homes.
That I don't know.
This was Sarkari furniture, no?
Yeah. With the numbers written in like paint.
Then after it was sold, poor people would buy it.
Yeah.
And then when it would break, they would burn it for firewood.
Yeah.
But I have seen it not just in my father's house, because he's an architect, but in other people also, let's say, whatever, university professors.
Yeah.
This is your basic Chandigarh citizen.
Yeah.
And people used to, you are completely right, put that furniture, the Chandigarh furniture, right next to and just as comfortably with cane furniture, and bent bamboo furniture, and colonial furniture, and the Muda.
Yeah.
All the Chandigarh chairs were part of that one continuous landscape.
Yeah. They were not thought of as designer.
They were not
objects.
sort of as designer things for Europe se aaya.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, today if you go to Punjab Engineering College, and I always point that from the bus to my students when we get out, there's a guard cabin right at the entrance. The guard has a beautiful
Chandigarh
chair and
because
table.
That's Sarkari furniture, no?
It's one of those
Government
where the chair is kind of joined with the table.
Yes.
Nice.
So, no, but what I'm trying to say is that furniture was part of the Chandigarh ordinary furniture. Cheap, everyday, ordinary furniture everywhere found.
Yeah.
Which is also why it was discarded, because, who gives a shit? You want to buy a fancy sofa. When you can upgrade, you buy a nice Italian-looking marble floor and a good, So it belonged to the ordinary furniture.
I have
category of cheap furniture.
Yeah, I do feel, and you're right about this, it did belong to the category of cheap furniture. I do feel that when Jeanneret came to Chandigarh, for the first 5 years, apparently 6 years, I think till the mid-50s at least, late 50s, he was quite taken up with designing furniture that was made from found material. So he, for example, made material which was made of bamboo or pieces of wood or other materials that were discarded. And he was at that time thinking about that this cheap furniture would become popular in the public eye. And I think by about the mid-50s, he seems to have suffered a disappointment in terms of the fact that it was not really gaining popularity, or there were no buyers or there were no sponsors for that kind of furniture. He did go to Delhi and he did, I think, share his ideas at some exhibition that happened in Delhi. But he came back, and then I have observed, at least in the archives, that he no longer draws that furniture or makes it. And that is the point at which he begins to think about that teak wood furniture and the craftsman. It's possible that by that time, we have to realize that when you're coming from British India into independence, craft is also undergoing some mutation, some sort of transformation. It's possible that maybe there was a body of craftsmen who re-established themselves in Punjab, and he was able to find out who they were and think about what they did.
That can be researched. I know some of the furniture, people who made the furniture, Salwan, etc.
Okay.
And this needs to be researched. But you spent a lot of time with the Aditya Prakash archive also at the other CCA, right? At the Canadian CCA.
Absolutely.
Did you find any continuity between the Pierre Jeanneret archive and the Aditya Prakash archive? Or what was your experience with that?
Well, for starters, of course, Aditya Prakash interested me because, other than, of course, I knew that he has the same last name as you. Aditya Prakash interested me because I saw that he was one of the people who was part of the Capital Project team. And of course, I was intrigued to know about each one of them. But then each one of them did not have an archive. But Aditya Prakash had an archive there, and which was all ready. And I felt that reading that archive would give me more information. I also realized that Aditya Prakash had done some fairly significant projects in Chandigarh. Jeanneret had talked about that, and then Aditya Prakash.
What do you mean Jeanneret had talked about? Where did Jeanneret talk about that?
Well, Jeanneret mentions the projects that are going on in Chandigarh. So, and he mentions that who is doing what project. Mathur is doing that project, and Chaudhary is doing that, and Aditya Prakash is doing that. So there is some note of that. So I was interested to know who these people really were. And then came around the archive, and I began to look at the archive. It was interesting to me because I'd always been interested in the beginnings of architectural education in India. Initially, I looked at Aditya Prakash as an educator, as someone who conceptualized what the state of architectural and design education would be in independent India. Of course, I began to read his diaries and the hope with which he came to India, the aspirations with which
What was his aspiration?
His aspirations was, in a very broad sense, to be able to contribute to what the new independent India would really become.
Right.
And that's why he was very excited by the fact that he was going to be working for the Capital Project team. It almost is a switch for me in what he's learned back overseas, and then when he comes, it's almost like he's in this no man's land, in this space where he's very unsure of what the future will really bring.
Right.
And I found that to be interesting for me. Regarding the buildings themselves, while I was doing the archive, I've also got information about the book that you did, the One Continuous Line, which in some ways systematized the archive for me. But what I had been excited about in the archive was also that Aditya Prakash was, other than talking about buildings, he was also talking about cities, which no one had talked about before. No one had talked about in the 60s and only in the early 70s there was some interest in Indian urbanity and what it could become, potentially what it would become. But Aditya Prakash was talking about an urbanity that I felt was relatively uncontaminated. It was an urbanity that was not influenced by any overt source from the West. So he maybe the way he was combining his combinatorial way in which he was putting this urbanity forward, an urbanity of the linear city or of the city that was repetitive almost in this morphological way, but which had variety in the way in which families and their homes with courtyards would create complete mini ecosystems in themselves, I think was very interesting. What perplexed me, like I told you in the morning, was that Aditya Prakash did not conceive of cities as systems. For him, the system was the city with each family being one unit. But he did not think, for example, about the collective building, about the apartment block.
He never did the apartment block.
He never built the apartment block, even though I know that in the 60s there is a very strong influence of the Soviet planners and the American planners, but he never builds the apartment block. And I know that Jeanneret, for example, is influenced by what the Soviets are doing in Jamshedpur and Durgapur, in other places, because there is American and Soviet influence coming into India. So obviously the idea of how they build apartments and the microrayon, the collective housing in Soviet Russia, would have been coming in. But Aditya Prakash does not seem to have picked it up and made it into some way of organizing his city. I think his city, in many ways, for me, was an experiential city. It was a city where there was a very strong sense of an outer urbanity, and there was an inner sense of where the family resided.
Very much so. I mean, I think his sense of life in the city was derived from his experience of growing up in a joint family in Muzaffarnagar. And that's the kind of life he wanted to sort of integrate into a rich modernist experience, with traffic segregation and urban recycling and close integration of urbanity and agriculture with animal husbandry. But the sense of life was that old city life that he grew up in.
I did not detect the impression that it had been thought about in terms of its longevity. And when I say longevity, I'm talking about the fact that at some point these infrastructures that were being put, these ramps which were being put to a raised thoroughfare, or these bazaars which were made at like the upper level of cities, and lower levels were walking spaces, and these sort of man-made artificial segregations between residential areas and commercial areas. At some point age and time would remove these separators, and I don't think that sense was there in the project, but maybe it was more an ideogram. It was more provocative set of diagrams than a real project.
Right.
Aditya Prakash did seem to be disappointed at the fact that his ideas were not being picked up by the Punjab or the Haryana governments.
That's right. Well, he was generally disappointed highly with postmodernism. He thought the idea that the Indian lifestyle was encapsulated by the morphology of the city misses the point entirely. The Indian lifestyle is a structural entity which is in a certain coding of relationship to animals and to recycling and to waste management and so on. And it's not a formal thing.
Although I feel that the similarity between Aditya Prakash and Jeanneret is the fact that they both think differently. They both think that the Indian family unit is a resilient unit. It can survive time. Aditya Prakash
but I'm saying, unlike, let's say, later on with postmodernism, with Varki and even B.V. Doshi in Jaipur, or even Raj Rival, etc., what happened in the 80s, a kind of a trying to extract a morphological structure as if that was a imprint of a certain way of life. is not a modernist idea.
Yeah.
And for Pierre Jeanneret or JT and my father, the Indian way of life was a structure, was not a morphological idea. It was a systems idea.
Absolutely.
How things related, and you gave it a new morphology.
Yeah.
That was the difference.
Yeah, absolutely.
You didn't cut paste the village and clean it up and abstract it a little bit.
Yeah. You changed the structure itself.
You changed the structure itself, but you maintained the relationships.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So you take a village structure and make it into a 5-star hotel was laughable for my father.
Yeah.
Right? The Moria Sheraton would be an insane project.
Yeah, it would be like the king of pastiche.
King of pastiche. But that is what was celebrated. That was what I was taught through the 80s and 90s.
Yeah.
I'm just talking about what they thought.
Yeah.
I'm just digging in on this sort of completely insane insight you have given me that PJ or JT was creating a vernacular. It gives me a very different reading of what a vernacular is versus a morphological reading.
Yeah.
Which is surprising because you're a morphological man.
Yeah, I am. I'm. But that's like another part of my brain, you know. So, but I feel that here, it's a new. Maybe it was because they felt this city has a right to be, and this city is coming up on a strata that had habitation prior to its time, and you cannot like remove that totally, but you have to think about things that are different and new in the future.
Well, the mandate for Chandigarh, it had to be modern. So let me add toward the end, here you have a lot of interest in domestic space also, right? In the modernist domestic interior.
Yes.
And you've done that one article on the interior of my father's house, Doshi's house, Charles Correa's house, and you have a conversation there with Peter Scriver as well.
Yeah.
What is your sense of the modernist interior space?
Well, I don't want to give a very broad answer. I'll give an answer that is more specific to the Indian context.
Yeah, of course.
Which I think would be quite interesting.
Totally, I meant the Indian.
To the discussion. I feel that number one, that modernist interior has been grossly understudied.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I would think that its study is imminent and urgent, if at all we want to receive any answers on what this modernity was really all about, because we are only looking at the buildings in a very superficial manner by their speciality, their formality, and the way in which they're positioned within a landscape.
Yeah.
I think, to be very honest, if at all we say that this modernism or this resultant modernism came from the outside and it was adapted to the Indian context, then I feel that the inside of the house, the inside domestic space, is where you had the effective collision between this outside modernity and between the traditions that still survived, or whatever situation they survived in.
So what was the collision?
I think the collision would have been in the spaces, in the way these spaces were used, in the way these spaces were embellished, in the way these spaces took layers of meaning.
No, but
not just the spaces, but also the identities of the people who were using them.
I see this, I see these picture books, Chandigarh occupied picture books. And these international photographers obsess about this. Here is Abar Corbusier and Jeanneret and Maxwell Fine-Gendreau. And now these Indian people live in it and they put up their own character onto the buildings. That would, people put their own character onto buildings no matter who designs it. Even people in the pole in Ahmedabad put their own character onto the building because, everybody wants to make their own space. Okay. But I want to connect it to the idea that Pierre was designing a vernacular. You claim it's a vernacular, right?
Yes.
Chandigarh modernism is a vernacular. So it's not an outside thing.
It is not an outside thing, but it takes time to practice this new vernacular that's coming in.
Correct. But it's new.
It's new, absolutely.
Yeah, it's a vernacular, but it's new.
Yeah, it's like saying it takes time to practice how to eat in a restaurant. When you go there for the first time, you actually get some sense of what the trappings are. Or even you go to
South India and you have to eat a dosa, it takes time to
practice.
practice.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a whole choreography of the body. There's a whole way in which the space and its meanings, they encode in your mind. You make the space and the space makes you. You make your identity based on that space. And I felt in the article that I did with Peter Scriver and the one that I would like to do in terms of the interior, the modernist interior project, that I think more research needs to be done in terms of how that space and to what degree that space made you and you made that space. So I think there were two sides to it. There was one side which was the performative side, where you performed in that space and it became overt or visible to the outsider that it was modernist, or that you had adapted to modernism in a particular way. But the other, I think, was a very personal meaning that it provided to you in terms of how it accommodated your mess. And which is why in Doshi's home in Ahmedabad, most of us, we only saw the living room and to some extent the kitchen area and then to the outside. But it was only later that I saw little glimpses of what the bedrooms were like, what the other areas were like, and how there was, one could call it studied mess in terms of how the study was arranged, or how a room was arranged, or how, even Doshi's office at Sangath, even though it was in a semi-modernist building, there was a way in which it had accommodated what he really wanted to do and how he wanted to be seen. But there were parts of the building that were very personal, which were only his and his family's, but there were other parts that were visible to the outsider. And I feel that sort of give and take between the two of them is what makes the
That's
modernist
a very
interior.
Indian thing, no? I mean, we maintain a certain public facade, and then there is your own personal space. There is the batak, and then there are there is always a division between those things, right?
There is a division, but there is also a expectation that the space will only be visible at particular points to the outside.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. That division is a very deeply Indian structural thing, correct?
Yeah.
Particularly if you're Muslim, and I'm not saying just Muslim, but even for Indians, there's that separation, there's sort of a problem.
Yeah.
But I was very interested in your reaction because these photographs I found that this photographer took of our house in Sector 8 in Chandigarh right after it was built in 1969. How do you read those photographs? Well, we can't see the photographs, but
yeah, we can't see the photographs, but these are, and I can just quickly describe them. These are photographs that are not, they are not photographs of the house in terms of its architecture. I think they are photographs of how these spaces are occupied, where the subjects in the photographs are not even looking directly at the photographer. The photographer is literally, in some ways, sort of, looking at the photographs through gaps, spatial gaps between how the peoples really reside. And often the photographs are not views that are complete perspectives, which we would normally do when photography would be done, when architectural photography would be done of the building. So they are in some ways chance encounters with the space and how the space is used. And I feel that for me is a missed set of experiences which I encountered when I started thinking about photographs could inform our knowledge of modernist interiors, which happened with the earlier living room projects that I did with Peter Scriver, where I uncovered this trove of photographs, where I realized that one is the reading of the space through the plans and the sections and the elevations and through your visits, but the other is the reading of the space through this occupation of space and its recording, its accidental recording at the edges, not always at the center. Now, why this also interested me is because I had encountered similar photographs in Jeanneret. When Jeanneret was photographing the hutments and the settlements on the Chandigarh site, some of his photographs were these photographs that were not
with
bang in the
doing
center.
things,
They were like from through the gaps, as it were, almost as if they were chance encounters with what's really happening in that space, which for me was interesting. It also added credibility to the fact that he was a very meek man. And then I uncovered a document that Jeanneret had written which said that he had practiced some lines कि 1 minute माफ करना photo ले सकता हूँ कि नहीं.
Oh, really?
And this is written in some of those documents.
Really? So
Yeah.
he practiced 6 lines.
Yeah.
And I see.
Yeah.
So he photographed kind of village life,
Yeah.
vernacular
Yeah.
in life. And I can see those Chandigarh photographs that my father took, an attempt to also produce a vernacular.
Yeah.
Like here is life happening in the house.
Yeah.
I think that's the... I think you have just uncovered that must be the mission given by my dad to this photographer.
Absolutely.
Okay, pretend like you are just recording life.
Yeah, pretend as if we are doing things, you know. Like we are in the course of cooking a pizza or scratching my back, you know.
Pizza to nahi hota tha un dino.
Yeah.
They didn't have pizza.
Yeah.
I think that's right. That must have been the director.
So, you know, for example, what is the importance of the lady of the house looking upwards to the terrace where your father and the 2 kids are standing?
Yeah. It's performing domesticity.
Performing a domestic function, you know, calling them for dinner.
Yeah.
And there's nothing significant about it to be photographed.
Yeah.
But I think the photographer communicates that because it shows, you know, the connectivity.
Yeah.
And it also gives us the perception of how the house works, the workings of the house.
And of course, my father wants to be the star of it because then he has this photograph of him juggling.
Yeah.
And all us kids, they're like admirably looking up to him.
But I think it also uncovers one other observation that I want to make, which is on modernism. And I feel that in the early stages of modernism, as it arrived in India, as it was encountered in Chandigarh, there was a propensity towards taking photographs that were devoid of people, devoid of human activity.
Still is.
Yeah.
Still architects
large
don't take
landscapes.
pictures without people.
But, you know, when Jeanneret started taking photographs, he wanted to include these people in there.
In his own buildings?
Even in his own buildings, and
Really?
even on the streets that he was photographing. Children's playing, and then stop people collecting on one corner, and one may say this was documentation, but I don't think he was documenting. I think he was talking about what the experience of those people were. I think there was something similar going on when your father was getting the home photographed, where this photographer was not really photographing the object per se, but what happens inside it, how the space is occupied.
What a fascinating conversation, Manu. You have great, wonderful insights, and I'm looking forward to your presentation here at the University of Washington right after this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vikram. Your questions are extremely introspective, which is why my answers are colorful as they are.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Architecture Talk. This is your producer, Mary Lee. We hope you enjoyed the conversation, and if you did, please subscribe and rate us on iTunes or Spotify. We would also love to hear from you if you have any suggestions on new topics or guests. You can always reach out to us on our website, Facebook, or Instagram. Thanks again, and until next time, this is Architecture Talk.